Hi, I'm Marie Raboin with Dane County Land Conservation, where I work as a grazing specialist and then a conservation specialist doing general conservation agriculture around the county. This video that we're working on today is we're going to talk a little bit on grazing cover crops and kind of some of the differences that I see between grazing cover crops and annual forage production, because I sometimes think they all get lumped together and that's fine, but I do think it's important to talk about some benefits of each and the differences between the cover crop grazing system and an annual forage production grazing system. We can talk about cover crops in a way where the cover crop is performing all the ecosystem services that we want. It's infiltrating water, preventing soil erosion, maybe sequestering some carbon. And then kind of at the end of its life in the spring, when it's done all these things for us over late fall, winter, and early spring, we can still take that cover crop and use it as a forage source for livestock, which I think is kind of the best case scenario because it's done its job for us over the year, and then we can still get that economic benefit from that cover crop at the end of the year. We can harvest the cover crop for forage later in the year, or if we don't want to do that, we can just put up a fence or let cattle out and graze the cover crop off before our primary crop would go into production. So another system that I think has been kind of lumped under cover crops or umbrellaed with cover crops is more of an annual forage production. Maybe you do like an oats and peas early in the spring that you graze off. You follow it with a millet, a sorghum Sudan, something that's more of your heat lover in the summer. Graze it off or cut it for forage, and then move into cereal rye or something in the fall that's going to carry you and give you that green cover over winter. That I would consider a little bit more of an annual forage production, but I think calling it grazing cover crops I think is also fine. All right, so now we'll talk about our typical crop system in Wisconsin, which is corn and soybeans. There's a few ways that I think the farms around here have figured out how to do it. One way would be hiring an airplane and we fly cereal rye onto an existing corn or soybean field, harvest that crop after we've flown the seed on. Seed usually goes on early September. 8 out of 10 years, you'll get a decent stand broadcasting. You could also broadcast with a fertilizer buggy, but broadcasting cereal rye onto a corn or soybean field. You can always come back in the spring and graze that off or take it for forage. One thing would be everyone gets nervous in the spring because sometimes that rye really does take off on you. Still haven't seen a crop failure due to a rye cover crop. So I think for the most part we've figured out how to manage that. And you can always bump back corn maturity dates a little bit here or there if you have to. Another really great system that we're standing in, you can't tell, is this farmer planted his corn on 60-inch rows or 60-inch wide rows, which is a little bit crazy. You plant the same amount of corn, you just really pack it in one row. So if you're planting, 32,000 population, you're still planting 32, you've just set your planter at 70, basically. But what's neat about that is you can come in at about V3, V4 with interseeder, you can broadcast, you can airflow, really whatever you have access to. That cover crop kind of sits and hangs out. It kind of looks spindly for a while. As long as we get adequate rain, it kind of just hangs out down there for the year. And then when you come in and either take that field for silage, preferably for silage or snaplage, something that's going to come off a little bit earlier, that cover crop grows up. And these cattle have been out here for weeks. There's not much left now. They mostly have stover. But a few weeks ago, it was just a beautiful green stripped field that looked really strange, I'm sure, to all the neighbors. Forage turnip, radish, some annual rye, millet. He had sunflowers out here, a little tiny bit of sorghum Sudan, and all of those survived pretty well in that system. So that I would say is like cover crop 601, where flying or broadcasting rye onto a field is like cover crops 101. This is definitely a more highly managed system. The other low-hanging fruit with grazing cover crops is obviously going to be getting a crop in after winter wheat harvest. We've got a ton of growing degree days left. You can really experiment with different species of plants, seeding rates. You can always experiment with even interseeding like red clover into your wheat and having that kind of sit around and hang out until wheat harvest. There's a lot of options with winter wheat. A few things to consider with grazing cover crops, and the farms that are doing this really successfully in Dane County have experimented, over the past 5 or 6 years to kind of figure out what works for them. Probably 90% of the time you're going to use cereal rye. We're in Wisconsin. It is what it is. It's a fairly inexpensive seed. Most people have the ability to plant it or broadcast it, and it grows. It might sit there for a while if we don't get rain, but eventually it grows. That's kind of what I think our tried and true is going to be. However, there's other really good choices. Triticale with a vetch, if you can pull that off, is a really excellent feed source come spring. I mean, when Carl harvested his last year, it was high quality dairy feed that he was getting off of his cover crop. The other thing is matching your livestock to the type of feed. So if you're a grazing dairy, there's some really nice forage that you could grow early in the year and potentially start grazing your dairy herd a little bit earlier than you typically would in your cool season pastures. Another consideration when grazing cover crops is just the fact that, large animals can do some damage during our freeze-thaw cycles in this part of the state or part of the country. And just being cognizant of, hopefully you have enough management over that animal, or the farmer does, where you can pull them off when we hit those 40-degree days and 20-degree nights, because that's when we're going to see damage from hoof action. And it's not that you're not going to wreck a field really, but if you're a no-till farmer and you don't want to use tillage, it's a real bummer to go out there and have to till something up that you didn't plan on doing. So as a TSP, when you first meet a farmer, come out to a farm, and you're talking to them about maybe how to make cover crops pay, economics of cover crops, integrating their livestock into their cropping systems, there's a few things I think about. What equipment do they have? Because that's number one. Like, if they don't have the equipment to drill in cover crop after any of their row crops, then you need to think of alternative ways for them to get seed in the ground. Then what's their harvesting equipment like? Because especially with something like cereal rye or triticale, if they want really good feed in the spring, they need to cut it when it needs to be cut, and they don't want to be waiting on a neighbor for that. However, there are plenty of people who are also just looking for tonnage. And then I would say it's not as critical if they don't have all that equipment. One of the main things to think about when integrating livestock into a row crop production farm is your water situation, because we're typically growing these cover crops on our shoulder seasons, which are those seasons when we get freeze thaw and where we can't just always run a hose and a pipe to get water to animals. What I'm seeing a lot of is after a couple years of this out on these fields is when the farmers start to, I would say, invest more in a frost-free water system, really. Because they now have seen that, whoa, if I can keep animals out, in some situations, I would say 6 to 8 weeks longer than what my permanent pastures can handle, that's 6 to 8 weeks that I'm not hauling manure. It's just a lot less management. You're not feeding. The cattle themselves benefit from being outside, obviously. But we have to get water. It's really cool when a farmer gets to the point where they want to kind of double down and invest in the water, and then of course also fence for grazing row crop farms. Those are the two places where, as a TSP, we're there to help match these folks up with the cost share grants, things like that, so that they can get the infrastructure they need to manage the system. Some of the practices that we want to look at and equip are going to be 528 managed grazing is obvious. We can cost share that up to 3 years for different levels of intensity of managed grazing. 512 for any of our cropland conversions into managed grazing or interseeding, and that's our forage and biomass planting standard. For grazing cover crops, we can use 340. And what's neat about our cover crop standard is that it does allow grazing to be a termination method at the end of the year, grazing or harvesting of that cover crop. So conclusions for grazing cover crops. I would say, again, we need to look at current management systems, what machinery is available, what the goal of that producer is, what their current management is and, just tweaking that up a little bit here and there. Really, their comfort level with cattle management, I think, is a really big one for grazing cover crops, because if these are animals that are almost always on a lot and then you're asking them to do something that they don't really know how to do, give them some grace and give yourself some grace, because it's going to take a minute for everyone to learn a new system. Any type of management change in the world, we just need to realize that it takes time, and also hard things can be really hard and they get easier and easier and easier as you go. And then just, overall for any of these systems where we're looking at something that maybe is a little bit out of the ordinary, is it's so important for people to kind of find their people in their community, find a few friends that they can kind of joke around with, and then also commiserate with when things don't go well, or celebrate with when things do go well. There's nothing I love more than a farmer sending me a Snapchat or whatever they do of a bragging moment they had with one of their other farmer friends. That's perfect. And so community at the end of the day is really what's going to make people succeed.